Hi everyone, welcome to our presentation on atmospheric theatre, open air performance in the environment, which is an AHRC funded project that myself, Chloe Preedy, and my colleague Evelyn O'Malley have been running together over the last 2.5 years. We're going to be speaking to you about various aspects of this project. I'm going to start by talking about some of the overarching context and some of the research into literary texts that I've conducted that underpin some of the subsequent performance related research we've been doing, which Evelyn will talk about in a bit more detail when I hand over to her shortly. This project was our interest in this project was spurred by the fact that air pollution is an incredibly serious issue for everyone. Over the course of our lifetimes, the average person will breathe in 250 million litres of air. So we're incredibly dependent on the air that sustains us, but also incredibly dependent on its quality. Clean air is something that's important to all of us. Now, to some degree, the coronavirus pandemic has been making us more aware of the quality of the air around us. Debates about, for instance, the difference between droplet transmission and aerosol particle transmission have been in the news. People have been thinking about masks, about the aerial environments that we share with others. But actually, I was recently searching Google Trends to see how much interest in air pollution had spiked as a result. And air pollution itself has not received as strong a leap from this particular focus as I initially had expected might be the case. It seems as though the very fact that the air is invisible and only sometimes perceptible to our senses makes it still quite easy for us to overlook the air as such, as opposed to more perceptible things that might be moving through it. And that's a problem because air pollution, as this World Health Organization graphic makes clear, remains an incredibly serious and deadly threat to global health across the world. Around 7 million deaths globally are attributed to air pollution in one form or another. Now, partly this is a question of geographical unfairness to some degree, something that we should be aware of for that reason, because as you'll see from this particular map, it's significantly different depending on what part of the world you live in, how far you are impacted by this issue. But it's something that everyone should also be aware of, because in every part of the world, air pollution remains an issue. And a Public Health England report, for instance, noted that air pollution is the biggest environmental threat to health within the UK. Now, these issues are particularly interesting to me as an early modernist, someone who works on the drama of Shakespeare and his contemporaries, because the 16th century, the latter part of it, is really one of the first times that people started within Europe and particularly within England, drawing attention to the question of air quality as an issue. As this particular graphic by Peter Grimblecombe and Carlota Grossi illustrates, sulphur dioxide levels were rising rapidly within early modern England. So too were other forms of pollution, including particulate pollution levels. And this was largely linked to a kind of urban expansion and an emerging industrialised use of coal. So the kind of industrial pollution elements that we are still living with today were starting to become a factor within early modern experiences of air quality. And writers at the time were starting also to reflect on the medical implications. Robert Burton, a 16th, 17th century physician, wrote about the way in which a clean air cheers up the spirits, exhilarates the mind, whereas he argued that a thick, black, misty air might overthrow the mind, and argues that great heed is therefore to be taken how we let in or exclude this ambient air. Now, Burton wasn't thinking about the threats to the health of air pollution in perhaps quite the same way as most medical authorities would today. But nonetheless, this convergence of themes is interesting to me, especially because it also simultaneously overlaps with the emergence of the professional theatre within England, and indeed the building of these theatres and more generally a kind of European trend as it continued. Because what was happening at the time was that most of the theatres that were being built within this expanding and polluted London were open air venues, therefore venues that were simultaneously exposed to the air, but also partially enclosed as well, providing an interesting liminal space within which writers and performers and audience members might reflect on the quality of the air that they shared and experienced. So this research that I'm going to talk about now relates to my book project. I have a forthcoming monograph on this, Theatres of the Air. And as for this particular monograph project, I focused on 102 plays that could be associated primarily or exclusively with performance at open air venues, representing work by, among other authors, Thomas Heywood, Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and William Shakespeare. And this kind of this sort of literary research identified several key trends within the drama of the time, several key ways in which people evoked or thought about the air. The first was similar to that which we've already seen within Burton's work, where Shakespeare within A Midsummer Night's Dream kind of encapsulates this trend, where people thought about the way in which the air fuels the operation of the mind, the imagination. That is, the air we breathe in powers our brains and our fantasies. But Shakespeare also inverted this, thinking about the way in which the theatre then made these imaginary thoughts manifest. People experienced them through the air. And so imagination, the poet's pen, gave to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Other writers evoked fictional air quality and fictional aerial experiences. So in the play Pericles, for instance, we have characters engaging in an exchange about the direction of the wind that blows, in a way that invites audience members to think about fictional winds, but also perhaps real winds, and the way in which they disturb or impact on our aerial experience. Other playwrights thought about the way in which the air might become a resource, both in the literal sense of powering windmills or driving sail-powered vessels across the seas, but also in the fantastical sense of allowing people to fly. Thomas Decker's Fortunatus, for instance, features a character who describes how he is cut through the air like a falcon, flying from Babylon to Famagosta in Cyprus. And finally, we get ways in which, building on this particular trend of perhaps occasionally literally stage in flight episodes, playwrights and players thought about how they might alter the literal material atmosphere of the playhouses in which they were performing. Ben Jonson wrote this episode, for instance, in which a fictional scene of the perfuming of a fictional interior household also has a literal impact on the theatre environment, as incense is burnt in censers and flowers are strewn on stage. And that sensory impact is something that Christopher Marlowe also thought about in his War Dra Tamburlaine, thinking about how the use of guns during this performance would produce a smoke that transformed both the fictional and the atmospheric air of the theatre into this polluted environment, evocative of hell. Singe these black plains, his protagonist suggests, and make them seem as black as is the island where the Furies mask. Lines that register the material impact of air pollution on the theatre fabric, but that also draw figurative comparisons between the fictional experience of this pollution and a kind of air pollution conquest. Now, our project was interested in how these literary traces of air pollution and aerial experience might then translate into contemporary performance when people staged plays like this. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Evelyn to talk in more detail about this aspect.
Thanks, Chloe. So as Chloe has explained, I am leading on the contemporary performance part of this project, working with our partner organisations, Minack Theatre in Cornwall, the Willow Globe in the middle of Wales, and Duke's Theatre in Lancaster, where we're conducting audience research, carrying out focus groups with young audiences, and undertaking workshops with young theatre makers, and conducting archival work in these spaces. While audience members may not immediately think about the references to air from the early modern period that Chloe has just highlighted, they are embedded in air and engaging it in a way that ignites certain relationships between the fictitious and the actual air in the imagination. So the research for this strand of atmospheric theatres is underpinned by ethnographic and historical work on weathering Shakespeare, looking at audiences and open air performance, tracking them through history from the pastoral players in late Victorian England. These are the pastoral players, founded by Eleanor Calhoun and Lady Archibald Campbell in Surrey, where audience participation in the work was to retreat from a stuffy, polluted London and to the countryside, and then to return enlightened to the city, through what becomes a performance of not pastoral, but of weathering in the context of contemporary climate change activism. So this is BP or not BP's ultimately successful festival protesting fossil fuel sponsorship at the RSC. Participatory audience work here in the open air that many of you may be familiar with. So across history, we can identify cultural performances of weathering in the sense of a repertoire of gestural and discursive responses from audience members that reflect and are implicated in the cultural responses to environmental change. Some of them environmentally progressive and some of them less so, a bit more dubious. So over the past year, these practices have again shifted in significance as the experience transitions from one of togetherness and community, contemplating ways to try and sustain this community, when we are now aware of COVID-19 having contaminated the air beyond the pollutants and weather changes that we were already concerned with in this project, whereby open air performance and the open air in general has been touted as safer than other forms of theatre and experience of being together. So while this has necessitated already new modes of co-presence for audiences, and while our partners are very much at the fore of undertaking this work, we can expect the coming months to reveal more ingenuity and innovation in terms of weathering as an audience practice that is related to the air. So we might look to audiences for performance in the open air as already participating in an ethical response to weathering together within a changing and endangered environment. So that just leaves me to finish with the outputs for this project that are already available and may be of interest. We have a map of venues and spaces that are used for open air performance across the UK that may be of interest to practitioners. Likewise, we've created a range of educational resources for secondary school or high school students that engage with air pollution and have practical tasks in there too. And we'll have a special issue of Performance Research Journal on Air coming out soon. So thank you very much for your time.